Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. Hans Hermann Hoppe claims to have discovered an irrefutable foundation for libertarian ethics. His Argumentation ethics promises to prove once and for all that self-ownership and private property are presupposed by the very fact of debate, and that socialism cannot be defended without contradiction. To his followers, it sounds like a philosophy's checkmate, a shortcut through centuries of moral dispute straight to the conclusion that they wanted all along. But, when we look more closely, the foundations are much weaker than they appear. Hoppe begins by attacking non-cognitivism, a meta-ethical theory about the nature of moral language, yet his attempt to dismiss it misclassifies the entire framework, confusing a descriptive claim about how moral statements function with a prescriptive claim about what we should do. And that error matters because if non-cognitivism is even possible, Hoppe's project of deriving moral laws from argumentation cannot be self-evident. However, we can assume non-cognitivism is false, and so with that assumption we can look at what follows, and what follows is a closer look at the structure of argumentation itself. By examining its assumptions and its implications, we can see that argumentation, properly understood, does not smuggle in property rights, nor does it generate universal obligations. It shows only the practical conditions that allow people to talk and reason together. And when stripped of mystification, Hoppe's theory collapses into little more than a rhetoric disguised as logic. Hoppe begins with the critique of emotivism, the meta-ethical view that moral statements are not truth-apt propositions, but expressions of attitude like yay or boo. He attempts to show emotivism as self-defeating by presenting a trilemma. Number 1, he says, if the claim that moral statements are non-propositional is an analytical statement, then it's only true by definition and it's not about reality. Or, if it's empirical, it only describes historical usage of moral terms and gives no guidance on future interpretation. Or 3, if it's non-cognitive, it has no truth value at all. And so from this, Hoppe concludes that emotivism must contradict itself. If its core claim is meaningful, it cannot consistently deny meaning to moral claims. But this response reveals a confusion about the level of analysis. Emotivism is not a normative framework prescribing or proscribing actions. It's a meta-ethical theory, like realism, anti-realism, naturalism, non-naturalism, or error theory. It does not state how moral claims should be interpreted, but how they are best understood, as non-propositional utterances. Hoppe's critique collapses because it treats a descriptive meta-ethical thesis as if it was a prescriptive moral system. And this is a category error. Emotivism, being meta-ethical, makes an empirical claim about the nature of moral discourse. It does not issue moral directives itself. Thus, Hoppe's attempt to dismiss non-cognitivism fails. He misclassifies the theory, and in doing so undermines his own foundation, since his argumentation ethics is partly framed as a response to non-cognitivism. Hoppe's so-called critique of non-cognitivism has an understated importance in his theory. Explicitly, Hoppe attached emotivism to a socialist ethic, despite it being fully possible for an emotivist to boo each and every act of aggression. The real purpose of this poorly executed attack on non-cognitivism is to try and knock out an essential chess piece off the board before checkmating the king. If non-cognitivism can possibly be the case, the following theory of ethics could not be self-evident. That is to say, the possibility for all prescriptive statements, including those that Hoppe tries to pull out of argumentation, to not be truth-apt, would mean Hoppe could not infer them from deductive reasoning with the absolute certainty he wants. But, since he failed to knock out non-cognitivism, he has therefore already failed to show his ethics are irrefutable. However, suppose that Hoppe did give a credible refutation of non-cognitivism, and it's my view as an error theorist that one does exist. We can then move on to the centrepiece of the chapter, which is argumentation ethics itself. Hoppe declares, any truth claim is and must be raised or decided upon in the course of argumentation. For Hoppe, argumentation is not incidental but essential. It is the necessary means by which truth is to be discovered. To determine whether a claim is true for him is to subject it to justification, and justification in turn requires the practice of argumentation. Now, it's important to note that Hoppe is not speaking of argumentation as a mere set of abstract free-floating propositions. Rather, as he makes clear, argumentation is the activity of providing an argument, that is, the expression of justification, with the explicit aim of seeking truth. It consists of propositions and their inferred conclusions as actively presented and contested by two or more arguers with a shared intellectual goal in mind, truth-seeking. Hoppe's theory of argumentation is not limited to the articulation of descriptive preconditions, that is, his claims about what makes argumentation possible. Rather, in Hopper, we also find embedded within argumentation the presupposition of normative statements, i.e. ought claims. And obviously when we point out is claims and ought claims, it's at this point it's important to bring attention to Hume's guillotine, the fact that deriving an ought claim from purely descriptive premises is deductively invalid. The problem is known as the is-ought gap, or the naturalistic fallacy, and so must be avoided when attempting to ground any ethical system. So now that the is-ought gap has been stated, let's direct our attention to a conclusion that Hopper draws. He says, but given truth claims are raised and decided upon in argumentation, it follows that intersubjectively meaningful norms must exist, precisely those which make some action and argumentation, which have a special cognitive status, in that they are practical preconditions of objectivity and truth. So here we encounter an important but subtle assumption, and it is one that recurs throughout his entire treatise. Hopper appears to tether the very possibility of action to the prior existence of a norm, rather than understanding norms as secondary to or arising from actions themselves. This assumption is even more explicit in his opening chapter, where he writes, in order to avoid such possible clashes, i.e. conflicts, the rule of exclusive ownership must be formulated. Here, the assumption comes into sharp relief. Hopper presumes that certain action-enabling or action-prescribing norms must be in place in order for a given class of actions to be possible, i.e., in order to avoid initiating conflict, property norms must exist. In order to engage in argumentation, certain norms of argumentation must exist. Yet this is clearly not the case. The possibility of an agent performing an action is not determined by any norm that permits or prohibits it. It is, for example, entirely possible for me to assault, to kill, to rob, to lie, irrespective of whether such acts are forbidden by moral or legal norms. Norms, therefore, are not preconditions of action. To illustrate this point more directly, consider a simple case. Suppose there's a norm prescribing that one must eat a salad on every Monday. It's perfectly possible for a person to eat a salad on Monday without ever grasping or endorsing such a norm. Perhaps they simply enjoy salads so much that they eat them daily, thereby acting in perfect accordance with a prescription without consciously affirming it. Thus, whether or not a norm is accepted or even exists in any ontological sense, it remains possible for an individual to act consistently with it, and therefore committing to the action does not, by itself, imply any commitment to the norm that prescribes it. We can now see how this false assumption reappears in the explanation that argumentation presupposes absolute property rights, i.e. the ought claim that states one ought not aggress against another person's body or property, and thus paving the way to establish that argumentation necessarily presupposes the justification of capitalism and the refutation of socialism. Before moving on to these normative assertions, Hopper begins by presenting three descriptive claims about the nature of argumentation. First, he tells us that argumentation is not merely a cognitive enterprise, but also a practical affair. As a practical affair, argumentation is itself an action directed towards the end of justifying a particular norm. Second, argumentation, being a form of action, necessarily involves the use of scarce resources in one's body. As Hopper explains, to argue requires the employment of one's physical faculties, whether through speaking with one's mouth or typing with one's hands. And third, argumentation is a conflict-free way of interacting. This third descriptive claim emphasizes that in order to engage in argumentation, both interlocutors must refrain from aggression, or even the threat of aggression, since such acts would undermine the very use of bodily means required for argumentation to occur. If I am punching you, I cannot properly argue with you. Now, the way Hopper elaborates on this third precondition is essential. He writes, and it is to say nothing else than mutual recognition of each person's exclusive control over his body must be presupposed so long as there is argumentation. Hopper is saying that mutual recognition of each person's control over their body is a necessary precondition for argumentation to take place. But remember though, the larger position he's attempting to defend is that argumentation presupposes not only an understanding of these facts, but the adoption of certain norms, that is, prescriptive claims. The choice of language here is telling. By speaking of mutual recognition, he leaves open an ambiguity. Recognition could simply mean acknowledging the descriptive fact that each interlocutor controls their body, or it could mean the acceptance of a norm that grants or protects such autonomy. It's this vagueness that allows for a silent transition from is to ought, a transition that's not in fact valid. I can recognise that you're in control of your body without thereby affirming you have a right to such control. Yet, Hopper's ambiguity permits him to carry out this transition almost invisibly. On the very next page, the shift has become explicit. He writes, "Thus, it can be stated whenever a person claims some statements can be justified, he at least implicitly assumes the following norm to be justified. Nobody has a right to uninvitedly aggress against the body of any other person, and thus to limit or restrict anyone's control over his own body." Here, the crossing of the is-ought gap has been made overt. The descriptive fact that interlocutors must be free of coercion in order to argue is transformed into the normative claim that interlocutors possess a right to freedom from coercion. But one does not entail the other. Argumentation may indeed require the absence of coercion, but this requirement does not imply the existence of a right to be free from coercion. It remains logically possible to engage in argumentation without presupposing any such right, since norms, whether ethical or otherwise, do not enable or restrict the range of actions available to an individual. This is a false presupposition and philosophically incoherent. Having imported this normative claim under the guise of description, Hopper then attempts to draw out his supposed implications. Curiously, Hopper does anticipate the objection that he's guilty of crossing the is-ought divide. He insists, in making this assertion, one need not claim to derive an ought from an is. It no more follows from the classification of the principle underlying capitalism as fair or just that one ought to act according to it, than it follows from the concept of validity or truth one should always strive for it. So Hopper's strategy now then is to claim the ought is somehow intuitively embedded within the is, suggesting that just as truth implies one should seek it, so too does the descriptive structure of argumentation imply a normative ethic. But this is little more than sophistry. The idea that something is true means one should strive to know it is also invalid. It relies on the rhetorical force of the fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy, rather than any valid argument. It may persuade the untrained reader, but it collapses under philosophical scrutiny. This collapse perhaps explains why argumentation ethics has had virtually no influence on contemporary philosophy. The argument as a whole collapses into incoherency, and for that reason it can only be dismissed as nonsense. A proper descriptive account of argumentation shows only the practical conditions for people to reason together. From this, several points follow. Performing an action does not imply one ought perform it. Thus, engaging in argumentation does not imply one has a duty to argue, nor does it prohibit actions that would prevent argumentation. Conditional commitments. By choosing to argue, one temporarily forgoes actions that would preclude argumentation. That reveals a preference during the act, not a universal moral obligation. As for arguing for the end of argumentation, it is possible to argue in favour of an action that, if carried out, would prevent further argumentation. No contradiction arises because the commitment not to preclude argumentation only holds whilst one is actually engaged in it. Justification can be expressed through argumentation, but it's not identical to argumentation. An action may be justifiable in principle, even if once carried out, it eliminates the possibility of a continued debate. From this perspective, argumentation only reveals a conditional and temporary commitment to discourse. It does not generate a universal moral rule or property right. So, in conclusion, Hopper set out to prove that capitalism is the only ethic that can survive rational scrutiny, but the proof never actually arrives. His dismissal of non-cognitivism fails at the outset, his leap from description to prescription is invalid, and his entire system depends on ambiguity, smuggling ought into is through rhetorical sleight of hand. Argumentation does not generate rights, property, or political systems, it only describes the temporary conditions under which people engage in dialogue. When this is seen clearly, argumentation ethics is not a breakthrough but a mirage. It collapses under the most basic philosophical pressure, leaving behind no discovery, only a dressed-up justification for a property ideology. Hopper claimed to have solved ethics, but in truth, he has only revealed how fragile his case for capitalism really is. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.